well, since we kind of talked about my inspirations for following the Italian path, I wondered why did you decide to become an Italian professor?
Oh, let's see. In some ways, it was, I was a classics major as an undergraduate, and my father was an Italian poet, so I grew up in a household of books, and many of which were in Italian, and with a father whose livelihood depended on words in Italian. So in some ways, that wasn't an exotic thing for me. The way I've come to see it actually is quite an exotic choice for people. And I do wonder about the young people who come from just no default in their lives and choose it. But then actually I was in love with the classics, and it wasn't till finishing college I went to Columbia, and I thought that I was going to use classics. By then I'd become very interested in the early modern period, so I thought I was going to use my Greek and Latin to work with Paul Oscar Christeller, who was a great German Jewish emigre who had come to Columbia after during World War II as part of the flight of people like Auerbach and Spitzer, and Christeller was one of those, and he was at Columbia, and he was working on Renaissance philosophy, and so was preeminent in terms of this field and an area of early modern where you would be using Greek and Latin in Italian contexts, like Ficino, Neoplatonism in Florence in the 15th century, that kind of thing. But what happened is I am a person who's finally loves poetry, and so I just got pulled back by the vernacular, and the vernacular in my case was Italian, and Dante was such a great user of the vernacular, of what he calls the parlar materno, the mother tongue, that finally that just grabbed me and didn't let me go. But my first encounter with Dante actually was was when I was about 13, so long before going to college, when I was a kind of melancholic, intellectually young adolescent person reading poetry and feeling very, very melancholy about it in a kind of ecstasy of self-aggrandizement and great self-importance. And one of those poems was T.S. Eliot's Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and I found myself almost more focused on those mysterious verses on the top, the epigraph, which he does not assign to anybody, and which I read over and over and over, and I took them to my father, and I said, "What are they?" And he said, "That's Dante." And, he didn't actually find where it was from. It wasn't until years later that I found where they were from. But it's the first time I heard Dante, and the interesting thing to me is that I remember it lodging in my mind and having a kind of just a beauty and a pull that has never diminished over all these many decades.
So, probably a lot of that influence of the poetry in Dante comes from your father. So I'm wondering if he was a scholar of Dante at all, or
My father was not the least bit a scholar.
No.
he truly was a poet, and he was a writer. He was a novelist also. He was a journalist for his daily bread, which in an era in which he was born in 1910 in Italy, in an era in which you did not go to journalism school. Intellectuals became journalists because they could make more money and survive, and you could do writing poems and stuff like that. But no, he wasn't at all a scholar.
So being yourself a Dante scholar, I don't know if you could just talk about the differences between studying Dante in the United States versus in Italy, where there's probably a much longer history of study of Dante.
Well, that's an interesting question. At this point in my career, globalization has brought us many unfortunate things, but one of the good things is that personally I don't like to think of Italian scholars of Dante and American scholars of Dante. I find that a kind of unnecessary and passé. It was very much like that when I was young, and when I was young we would all be hoping that the Italian Dante scholars would would read us if we were writing in English and so forth, and there was this sense of a hierarchy. And, oh, I'm afraid that's my phone, I should have turned it off. But what's happened is that really globalization has broken that down quite a bit. My 3 books written in English have all been translated in Italian. But it was so important to me personally, my own personal trajectory, which may have something to do with my background and my Italian father, but my personal trajectory was ultimately to very much want to bring the Dante as I see him to Italians. And it ultimately has been mattering more to me to bring that Dante to Italians than to Americans. And the reason is because I think he's their patrimony, and it's so, this is a good part of what my lecture was about last night, it's so upsetting to me that they don't see him. And they don't see him that way because centuries of appropriation of the text, because of its reception history, because that text has been appropriated for centuries by the state in its formation of itself as a state, and by the Catholic Church. And the result is a text that is taught to Italians in ways that I consider not only deeply problematic, but deeply boring. This is why young Italians don't want to read the Divine Comedy. And I've been in so many trains where I've spoken to young Italians. Somebody said to me, "What do you do?" And I say, "What I do." And they say, "Oh, che pizza, che noia, oh." And that's exactly what I don't think the Divine Comedy is. And so I'm sort of on a life mission to try to show Italians. So when I won the Flaiano Prize in Italy in 2007, and I had a moment in an amphitheater in Pescara in the summer, late July of 2007, smelling the oleander, smelling the Adriatic, huge amphitheater. The literary prizes were the tiniest part of a program. The Flaiano prizes are given to film stars and TV stars, and so the literary prizes were the tiniest part of it, and it went on for 5 hours after I had my 2 minutes, and ended with a celebration of Stefania Sandrelli, if you can remember that wonderful actress. But in my 2 minutes on that stage and on Italian TV, I thought, you better take this opportunity to say something about Dante that they don't expect. And so you can see it, it's on YouTube. I started out and it sounded, I know they thought I was just going to go for the regular platitude. I was saying, you should all be very proud to have an author like Dante. And then I said, who says in Paradiso 19 that there are Ethiopians who will be closer to God at the Judgment Day than many Christians? And then there was this kind of moment, and then they all applauded. And that was the talk I gave last night, was very much coming out of that desire, the desire to have people simply see what they have in their cultural patrimony, which is an extraordinarily open and questing mind. And from that point of view, it's tolerant by definition because it's so questing. It's so adventurous. It's always trying to answer questions. So that up there in the heaven of justice, far up in paradise, Dante, instead of sitting back and being complacent, is saying, how can it be fair that the man born on the banks of the Indus, to whom nobody has ever read or written of Christ, how can it be fair that he could be damned? And then he says, Ove la giustizia che lo condanna? Where is the justice that could condemn such a man? Ove la colpa sua se non crede? Where is his fault if he does not believe? And for me, what I tell my students is, the remarkable thing is he's posing those questions. The fact that the answer then has to come back as it does is really not the surprise. The remarkable thing that we have to register is he's posing those questions. And I think that tells us something about our history and our cultural legacy, that in the 14th century we have thinkers who are able to pose questions in those terms.
It's clear that you've made efforts throughout your career to kind of change or bring a new perspective to the study of Dante. But have you actually seen ways in which the study has evolved, and especially as a woman studying in kind of a more male-dominated intellectual world. Like, have you seen differences throughout your career in the way that Dante is being studied?
Well, I mean, one thing is the anthropology of the professoriate, which has very much changed because I'm about to be 60. And when I started, there were indeed mostly men. And the early fields were more dominated by men, probably even than the later ones. And the study of Dante certainly had a kind of patriarchal flavor to it. And in this country was very associated with certain genealogies, which were definitely male. So, I mean, as Dante says in Paradiso 6, diverse voci fanno dolci note, and I believe diverse voci have been coming in. I certainly, you know, I am in many ways an old-fashioned philologist, and in at the same time that I'm working on these topics that I've just been describing to you, I'm also doing an edition of Dante's lyrics for Rizzoli, for the Italian publishing house. That is, by the way, one of the good things about globalization that we could never have imagined when we were young, that we would be able to have such a kind of transactional ease that an American scholar would be asked to do such a thing for an Italian press. But in work of that sort, say, so the first volume of my commentary to Dante's lyrics, which includes all the lyrics of the Vita Nuova and a number of others, so it has 58 in volume 1. And that work requires a lot of immersion in philology and in questions that really are philological, about transmission and manuscripts and editorial history. Though it is one of my own hallmarks that I try to look at the cultural always. So, for instance, traditionally Italian philologists of Dante have referred to the poems that Dante leaves out of the Vita Nuova as the extravaganti, the wandering outside ones. And I do believe I'm the first person to wonder what the cultural significance of that is, rather than just accept it as a philologically neutral term. But so, bringing it back to the whole question of Italian insecurity about the homeland, because there wasn't one, you know, and so that gets projected onto authors in interesting ways, and so authorial will to unify becomes sacrosanct, because we're living in a country that's fragmented and not unified. So I always try to think about things like that, even when I'm being quite philological. But so what I was saying is that in my commentary to Dante's lyrics, I do honor the philological. I try to bring the great work of Italian philologists to a wider public, including, and by which, since this is has come out in Italian, I am now trying to get it to come out in English. But so what I mean is the educated Italian person for whom those philological issues would be so forbidding that they would never look at those lyrics. So first, try to make it more accessible, and then show why it matters. And showing why it matters has to do with how beautiful and wonderful those poems are, and also for how those poems address questions that really have not been part of the critical discussion, like gender and so forth. So I do try to bring issues that are not canonical into the discussion, at the same time as respecting the historical ways in which they've been talked about, not overlooking the historical ways in which they've been talked about.
So in your course of work, you certainly get to do lots of kind of traveling and talking, and get to go to Italy. So I was just wondering what your favorite part about being a scholar of Dante is, and then maybe if you could reflect on what are some of the challenges that you face in your work, kind of your least favorite.
Those are interesting questions. Well, okay, to be totally honest with you, my favorite part, though I do love talking to young people, So I would put that very high, people like yourself. And I've talked a lot already today about trying to make accessible, because I really do feel that that's connected to the least favored, which is the degree to which one cannot help but feel that the study of certain things is more challenged by the economic and other factors in today's world. That certain kinds of humanistic study which were taken for granted and indeed privileged in my youth, now that I've risen to the top of the food chain, I'm sort of feeling like, oh my God, I've gotten here just in time to begin to see an erosion of the very underlying assumptions that allowed this to be considered privileged in the first place. So that's a very great challenge, to try to resist those erosions, those forces of erosion, and to try to constantly and proactively make the argument as to why this is important. So that's that on that. The thing I'm liking least. The thing I'm liking most is the positive side of making that argument, which is in an unanxious way, getting to talk to young people and so forth. But the thing I like most of all is going to sound very very narcissistic, but I think it would be untrue if I didn't say that Dante has been such an extraordinary source of spiritual sustenance to me, and that I feel so fortunate for that feeling of that you get when you get so deeply immersed in an intellectual problem that you do that time does sort of stop, and that doesn't happen every time I sit down to work. You have to have all the right situations for that to occur, but that the times that has occurred have been so life-sustaining in such a deep way, and I feel very, very grateful. So that would be at the very top.
Final question. Is this your first time at Holy Cross?
It is my first time at Holy Cross.
First impressions, how do you like it here?
I think it is absolutely wonderful. And my first impression when the taxi driver drove me through the gate yesterday was, wow, how much vitality, how much care, how much, what a repository for all the values that I hold dear. And, you know, this is, coming to Holy Cross is just, the first thing I thought was, this country really does have an extraordinary well of strength. And it's in a liberal arts institution of this sort that the minute you drive in, you feel everything's okay. Everything's okay. This country's okay as long as it has such a repository of places like this, which what a Phi Beta Kappa lecturer gets to do is go to precisely places like this and see and meet incredibly alive and vibrant and responsible and disciplined young people like yourself, which I've been hearing something about your year in Italy and your studies, so I know all those things to be true. And it just fills me with confidence. It fills me with confidence for the future and the future of this country and the future of learning. And I mean that. And it's been a wonderful experience to come here.
Thank you very, very much.